Hi, so last week I published this document, Building a Thriving and Safe GB Regulated Gambling Market, an analysis of the Social Market Foundation and the IPPR tax proposals and gambling regulations. So I just thought I'd go through some of the ideas in that document and explain why they're relevant to the racing strike on tax harmonisation that's happening this Wednesday. So for those that don't know, the BHA announced on the 17th of July this year that they'd submitted their formal response to the Treasury's consultation on remote gambling duties, outlining racing's opposition to harmonisation and calling for British racing to be taxed at a different and lower rate to all other forms of betting. Now I'm just going to set out in this presentation as to why I think that is a really bad idea and misses the point of the key issues involved here. So the tax harmonisation, what happened was earlier this year there was a consultation into whether or not online betting duties should be harmonised. So currently there's a 15% tax on online betting and a 21% tax on online gaming. And what the Treasury proposed was that they would have the same rate for gaming and betting. So that was all the proposal was. There was nothing else to it. It was just, should we have the same rate or keep it as we are where there's different rates. Now before 2019, I think it was, both of these two were taxed at 15%, and after the FOBTs had huge restrictions in betting shops, they put the remote duty up to 21. So they have in the past had harmonisation, but they're still different duties, so there's that ability for the Chancellor to have different rates. So the concern in racing was that these would be harmonised at 21%, and that seems to be what some in racing were worried about, and rightly so. So there's a proposal from the Social Market Foundation to raise an extra £2 billion, with the tax burden falling on more harmful products. And the idea was to increase remote gaming duty, from 21% to a colossal 50%, to increase general betting duty in betting shops and online from 15% to 25%. But they put a sweetener in there for horse racing, where they said that they would actually reduce general betting duty from 15% to 5% and increase the horse racing levy from 10% of gross profits to 20%. So this meant that the betting operators would have the same costs, but racing would get a bigger share. They were just going to swap some betting duty for some levy. So what this proposal actually meant, this chart here shows from 1986 inflation adjusted total gambling levy for the Treasury. So it was just over £2 billion in today's money back in 1986. It climbed up when the National Lottery and others were added up to about 1997, when remote gambling started to drift offshore, and this sort of happened. It sort of stabilised at just over 2 billion, and has increased in recent times when we've got the point of consumption tax, and offshore casino has come back to being onshore, and offshore betting has also come back. So you can see that it's just been just under 4 billion a year. Now what the SMF are proposing is just under 6 billion a year for the total tax burden on UK betting operators. And there was another outfit called the IPPR that are suggesting an even higher rate. They weren't going to give racing the levy sweetener, and they were going to also put tax up on land-based gaming machines as well. So they were looking at an even higher. You can just see how much historically that increase would be. It's a huge extra tax burden on gambling in the UK. So I think it's important when we sort of look at these things to look at what the operator economics are. So we look at online horse race betting. It's actually not very profitable for the bookmaker at the moment. So for £100 million of turnover, what this chart shows us, this table, that for £100 million, if you've got a gambler who loses 5%, so they might bet on all favourites, for instance, and they're just losing 5% on turnover. So the gross gambling yield on that would be 5 million. And you see that the duty gets taken off at 15%, the levy at 10%, and then we've got this new harm levy at 1%, and then we've got this huge media rights fee that is between 2 and 3% that racing charges on turnover now, which takes a huge chunk. And then we've got compliance and safety, safer gambling, which has come in recent years with all the reforms and affordability checks and so on. And then you've got some other costs there. So you can see that the 5% loser, if that's all they do on a, that's all a betting company has as its clients, they would lose 3.6 million on 100 million of turnover. For the 10% loser, the betting companies will make a slight profit, and for the 20% loser, they'd make a huge profit. So what you can see is that the incentive structure with the way the costings are right now is, if someone is just a 5% or even a 10% loser, so they're betting on racing singles, it's not good business for the operators. So it's probably best for them to either heavily restrict or shut down accounts that lose. So they're losing accounts, but they're not losing enough money after all these costs for the operator to make a profit. And this is the problem that racing has at the moment, is that the cost base means that it's not an attractive proposition as a standalone product for operators. Now, for this chart shows horse racing net and gross margins at different tax rates. So across the bottom here, on the x-axis, we have the gross margin, and this is the net margin on the y-axis. So you can see that if the bookmaker's making a 10% gross margin, they're just about in profit at a 15% duty rate. If the duty was to go up, if taxes were harmonised at 21%, they would need to make about 11%. So it's a slight difference. You can see that if someone was losing at 5%, it's still unprofitable for the bookmakers. They're losing about 3.6% net. So regardless of whether it's 15% or 21%, racing is still a really bad standalone product as the cost base currently stands. So this is the horse racing turnover and GGY across betting shops and online from 2017 to 2024. So if we look at the blue line here, this is after inflation adjusted. So 2018-19, there was about 18 billion turnover on British racing, or actually in all racing, with British bookmakers, British regulated bookmakers. And you can see that level has dropped off. It dropped off in betting shops after the FOTB regulations came in and betting shops closed. It's also dropped off in COVID in betting shops, but at the same time we've had affordability checks as well kicking in from this time. So the combined situation with affordability checks and the closure of betting shops has seen this turnover level go from 18 billion to 12 billion. Huge loss in racing turnover as the regulations are tightened on gambling in general in the UK. Now GGY has gone down from around just under 1.6 billion to around 1.3 billion, something like that. So it's not gone down as much, because what's happened is that margins have gone up. So this is online betting margins 2017 to 2024, and we can see that the margin has crept up in recent years from around 6% to just over 9%. It's also gone up from sports betting, but sports betting, generally there are more multiples in sports betting, so it's always been higher, but it's gone from about 8.8 to just over 10. So what this means is when we look at this duty rate, this rate here, 9.2% for racing, this is under the break-even net margin level under both duty measures. So racing is, as it stands online, it's a standalone product, is loss-making. I think it's important to recognise that as we think about what the best thing for racing to do is. So yeah, we can see, this is the chart, the table I showed earlier, these costs like media costs, compliance, like between the two of them, that's 3.7 million. That, if those weren't there, that would suddenly be profitable. If the levy was reduced, they'd be profitable. This level would absolutely be profitable. But at the moment, the bookmaker just does not want anyone under 10%, which is what the average is. The average is 9.2, so it's standalone, it's just not a good product to have. Sports betting is in a slightly better situation because they don't have the levy and they don't have the media rights. But even sports betting, the 5% customer we can see here is slightly losing after all the overheads, but the 10% customer, the bookmaker is making money. And obviously the 20% losing customer, they're making really good money on things like bet builders, lucky 15s, all that sort of thing. So we look at sports betting. This is the SMF proposal here, was to put the rate up from 15 to 25%. So you can see that at a 10% gross margin, the net margin drops from around just under 4 to just under 3, I think. Obviously still losing a bit more at the gross, at the, when you go under 5%. But this is the crucial thing, I think, to recognise, is even with the sports betting at 25%, which is the blue line here, racing, if they kept the 15% or the balance, the 15% plus the 5%, if they, if it went down to 5%, the levy went up to 20. So racing would remain unchanged. This is the racing line. It needs a 10% margin, where sports betting needs, around 6 or 7 to break even. So racing, even if the SMF changes happen, is still hugely more expensive than sports betting. Now move on to online gaming. This table shows if there's 10 million in gross gambling yield, the costs at different duty rates. So this is the current duty rate at 21%, and GGY 10 million, as I said, for all of them, and they pay the duty 2.1 million, and these were some estimates of the other costs involved, totaling at 8.1, a profit of 1.9 million. You can see as the duty goes up 25%, that profit drops to 1.5, 30%, 1 million, and at 50%, the SMF proposal, if the bookmakers, the operators don't change anything, they actually become loss-making. They lose $1 million on every 10 million of GGY. So, yeah, this is a chart. If the operators do absolutely nothing, and right now, for every 10 million in GGY in casino, they make 1.9 million. In sports, 3.6 million, if we assume a 10% margin. And on racing, they make 100,000 if we assume a 10% margin. So, as you can see, racing is very low. And on the SMF proposal, racing remains the same. a million would come off the sports and 2.9 million would come off the casino. So you can see at the moment racing is cross-subsidised. Like you cannot offer, it's just illogical to offer this product that's loss-making or only making a tiny amount unless you can attract these people that bet on racing to also bet on sports or also bet on casino. If you can't cross-sell to them, to be brutally honest, there's no point of having those customers. It doesn't make any sense. If you can force the margin up by getting people to bet multiples on racing at, say, 20% margin, then yeah, that's great. But you can't service the customers under 10%. So this chart, again, is if the operators do nothing on this table. Now what this is a typical operator with 30 million in GGY, and the majority at the moment, what operators do at the moment would be online casino. So we assume 18 million online casino, 9 million of it in sports betting and 4 million in racing. And we can see that currently an operator doing this can make 3.4 million on casino, 2.88 on sports, and a tiny profit on racing, giving them just over 6 million on so that would give them a margin of 21%, very healthy. Under the Social Market Foundation tax proposals, if the bookmaker did not adjust its behaviour at all, they would make a total of 0.32 million or 1.1%, which can absolutely wafer thin margin. And then here's the unregulated operator that has no compliance costs, no levy, no tax, no harm levy. Of the 30 million GGY, they'd retain 16 million at a 54% margin. So you can clearly see that at the moment, at 21% margin, it's not too bad. They can compete, but under the SMF, it just becomes, the bookmaker the operator has to change something in order to compete. So the operators would obviously react under those circumstances because they want to protect their net profit, not their gross profit. So they would cut costs by reducing promotions, e.g. free spins, best odds guaranteed, and early prices probably on horse racing, that sort of thing. They would reduce the number of licensed online games available. They would cut sponsorship, cut advertising, and cut TV programs, cut podcasts. They'd basically go on a cost-cutting exercise to increase their gross margin and their overall gross net profit. And then they would also try and increase their margins. So they would decrease the return to play on online slots. On sports betting, they would cull singles-only gamblers. So even if they could make a gross profit on a Premier League, someone betting on Premier League football, say they had someone betting £1 million that they made 5% margin, say 50,000 a year. After all the costs, it's just not, that customer's not worth having, so they would have to get rid of them. The same with racing. Anyone under 10%, anyone basically betting on singles would have to get rid of them unless they were betting on casino and multiples as well. If they were just betting on singles, that customer would have to go. And I think they would also have to increase the SP overrounds. They have been, I think they are going up at the moment. They would absolutely have to increase. So over the last sort of 30 years, if you bet every favourite, you'd lose about 5 or 6%. They'll have to bring that rate up in order to cover their costs. And this is an example of what they might do with online casinos. So you can see if they, on 10 million of GGY, if it was a 50% duty, they would straight away have to pay 5 million of the 10 million in duty. And we can see if they kept all the other costs as they were, they would lose $1 million. So what they could do is just say, well, we're going to accept that we'll lose 3 million in GGY by cutting a little bit on the safer gambling, really cut the marketing costs, have less games, try and cut the overheads and get the cost down to 5.8 million and then make £1 million profit. Or they could go even deeper and reduce it even more and make a higher profit margin. But the point is that if they do this, whereas what the Social Market Foundation think is that they can just increase the rate and the bookmaker or the operator won't change anything. They clearly have to, because they can't lose money on it. And if they did make survival cuts, that tax would drop from 5 million to 3.5. So immediately they would lose 30% of the tax revenue, just because the operator has changed. So this table here shows the Treasury revenue predictions for the Social Market Foundation tax changes at different levels of leakage, either people not carrying on gambling or migrating to the black market. So this column here is the baseline as with the current levels of 15% betting duty for racing and for everything else, and then remote gaming duty at 21%. And we see they make the Treasury gets just under 2 billion a year. Now, if all the SMF changes came in and the operators make absolutely no changes to how they operate, and gamblers make no changes either, then we'd see these rates go to 25%, 5%, and 50% from remote gaming. If there was absolutely no leakage at all, there'll be about a 1.8 billion uplift in the Treasury's tax. But the problem occurs if, as we just saw on the last slide, if the operators start making changes at a sort of mild leakage of 20%, that 1.8 billion increase becomes just over 1 billion increase. If there's a 35% leakage, it becomes only 510, and if there's a 50% leakage, it actually becomes loss-making. And the real problem is that if the whole of the gambling industry starts to go offshore, so even say if 20% goes offshore, that will start to get the ball rolling. Once people go offshore and they see they're getting a better deal, they get paid out and so on, or they go to the unregulated market, it doesn't have to be offshore, that gets the ball rolling, and we could lead us on to this 35, 50 in time. And the Treasury ends up really relying on a much smaller GGY level, and it's like 50-50 with the operators. So every pound lost to the offshore or unregulated market costs the Treasury 50p, whereas at the moment it's 21p. So the Treasury becomes more and more reliant on the black market not taking over. So I just wanted to talk about the gambling harm paradox. So Matt Zarb-Cousin, one of the leading gambling reformers in the UK, or even in the world at the moment, posted this interesting table on X, and he wrote, "The interests of the gambling reform lobby and the interests of horse racing are in perfect alignment. If the Betting Gaming Council thinks we are anti-gambling, it's obviously been huffing its own propaganda for far too long. Some forms of gambling are more addictive than others." Now, this was taken from the behavioural markers of harm and their potential in identifying product risk in online gambling. So what this table here, it's not actually about addiction, it is the correlation between a number of gambling harm, gambling markers of harm. So things like people depositing more than once in a day, people, I think, reverse deposits, if they still happen in some countries, and number of bets placed, those sort of things, and they measure it against what products people play. And slots came out the highest correlation at 0.34, and singles on racing was the lowest at 0.04, and we see singles on pre-event sports 0.09, and then you got combination bets on racing, that things like Lucky 15s, Yankees, that sort of stuff, 0.13, and then sports, it goes up to combination on sports 0.2 pre-event, 0.22 live. So obviously slots is the highest, singles on horse racing is the lowest. Now what I would say would be the gambling harm paradox is that we've seen from earlier in the presentation that singles on horse racing, because of affordability checks, because of the media rights costs and various other things, they're not viable. Online bookmakers can't take those bets. And the same with the sports. Singles are no longer viable. So we've created a regulatory environment and about to potentially create a tax environment where it's not viable to take bets on those, and we're also removing the ability to cross-subsidise between singles if people also bet on multiples. So we're going to actually lose the ability in the regulated market to take those bets. So we just formalise that. The legal harmful singles on racing and sports are the most affected. So the changing ecosystem will end up with more multiple bets and more casino bets and less singles. This has already started. I mean, I wrote about this 2 years ago on affordability checks as to why I thought they were such a terrible idea if they were supposed to be to reduce gambling harm, because they penalise people that want to bet on singles, where there's a lot of variance on horse racing and on sport, and yet the person that slowly loses on roulette with little or no variance doesn't ever take an affordability check. And also with, say, online slots, you've got 100 outlets, and so you lose with one a certain amount each month. You lose with 100 of them, you can bet what you like. Because if you're a winning racing gambler and you can only use one betting exchange, that affordability check cuts you out of the market completely. And if they increase the taxes on sports betting, that is going to cut the ability for the bookmakers to taking singles on sports. So the Premier League, only person betting on the Premier League win market will no longer be able to bet, or will be less likely to be able to bet. They'll lose if the cross-subsidy, so that these least harmful bets can no longer be taken, if the cross-subsidy is lost because casinos priced out of being able to be a decent product, and people are leaving to bet offshore, if that cross-subsidy is lost, these singles will absolutely not be taken. And the media rights for racing based on turnover, that is also causing on racing, makes singles on racing, because it's a 2.5 flat rate, 2.5% of turnover, that in essence moves the margin up by 2.5% required for bookmakers to make a profit. So I think there's millions being lost in revenue for racing, for bookmakers and the Treasury, because of the way the market is structurally moving away from singles towards multiples, towards online slots, online casino. The low level, the low losing, probably not harmed in any way gambler that wants to bet lots of singles on racing and sports can no longer do so. They're being restricted, banned, or banned because the bookmaker doesn't want to take the bets, or banned because of affordability checks out of the market. And all that revenue is either those people are no longer betting, or more likely it's gone to the unregulated market. So what are the solutions for the Treasury, racing and betting operators? Above all, we've got to protect channelization. We cannot afford to let the black market grow, the unregulated market grow. And we've got to all campaign against affordability checks. We have that people have dropped the ball on that, especially racing in recent times. They've focused on this very narrow channel of that small tax increase, thinking that's the thing that they can win on, and no longer even really talk about affordability checks. You know, we never had a day's strike for affordability checks, whereas they've caused a huge drop in turnover. That drop I showed earlier from 18 billion to 12, resulting from the affordability checks and the FOB-T regulations. And we never strike for that, racing's never strike for that, and yet they're striking because of this harmonisation of taxes. So yeah, campaign against harmonisation for sure, but they should be campaigning against any tax increases in gambling, because any tax increases affects the cross-subsidy, and without the cross-subsidy, racing does not survive. So I think we need to recognise the cross-subsidy between products, and that means the operators as well to acknowledge that they have been perhaps not making as much profit as they could by having things like best odds guarantees and other incentives to get customers in and then switch them on, cross-sell them to slots and other games. I think they need to recognise that racing has they are making money from racing, but it's indirect. And I think ultimately we need to rethink how the levy system works, because the current levy system doesn't work, where we have it's just on racing, and there's these huge media rights costs that no one really knows how much everyone's paying, and we don't know how much is going on that. And then you've got the levy, which is on gross profits just for racing. And I think maybe we need to switch that to something that recognises racing's contribution to the whole ecosystem. And so, you know, I think it's about $1 billion is lost every year on horse racing, and 10 billion overall on betting and online gaming. So if we switch the levy to something that was more representative of the whole ecosystem, it could be a much lower percentage. Maybe that's the answer. So yeah, just to sum up, if you want to read the full report, I'll put the link in the description below or in the next tweet. And yeah, I think racing's got too fixated on this idea from the SMF, the Social Market Foundation, and this idea that racing should go it alone without betting. Racing is betting. Well, it relies on betting anyway, and it needs to acknowledge that. And I think both sides need to acknowledge that. The operators need to acknowledge that as well. And yeah, we need to work together to get through this, and we need a growing gambling ecosystem in the country for racing to survive. Thank you.